6 enemy fighters, 1 American, no wingman, no way out. The radio crackles and then goes quiet. Fuel gauges bleeding toward zero. Every nerve in his body screaming one word, run, and instead, he pushes a nose directly into the threat, both engines lighting afterburner, the sky above North Vietnam turning white-orange behind him, and what happens in the next 4.5 minutes will be studied, replicated, and argued about in air combat training schools on 6 continents for the next 50 years. Most dogfights in the jet age last under 30 seconds. Pilots describe them as a blur, a sudden explosion of noise and G-force, and then it is over. This one lasted 4.5 minutes, an eternity in the sky. 2 pilots going up and over and down and up again, canopy to canopy at times, neither willing to yield, neither finding the decisive angle. By the time it ended, only 1 aircraft was still flying, and the lesson burned into the sky that afternoon over North Vietnam would change the way every serious Air Force on Earth trains its pilots. This is the story of Lieutenant Randy Duke Cunningham, call sign Showtime 100, and the most consequential aerial engagement of the jet age. To understand what happened on May 10th, 1972, you have to first understand the assumptions that sent American pilots into that sky so badly unprepared. The United States military had entered the Vietnam conflict, carrying an absolute certainty about the future of air warfare. The F-4 Phantom II, one of the most powerful and capable fighter aircraft ever built at that point in history, had been designed for a very specific kind of war, not the war over the jungles of Southeast Asia, a nuclear war, a long-range interception war, a push-button war where pilots would engage enemies at distances measured in miles, where radar would do the seeing and missiles would do the killing, where the idea of 2 pilots getting close enough to look into each other's cockpits belonged to an earlier, more primitive era. The engineers at McDonnell Aircraft had been so confident in this vision that early production models of the F-4 carried no internal gun at all, no cannon, in a war where missiles would always settle things from beyond visual range. Who needed a gun? The answer, as Vietnam was about to prove in the most brutal possible way, was everyone. Every single pilot who ever found himself inside the turning, burning chaos of a close-quarters aerial fight needed a gun, and many of them did not have one. The rules of engagement over North Vietnam required American pilots to visually identify their targets before firing. This single requirement dismantled the entire theoretical advantage of radar-guided long-range missiles. By the time a pilot could see a MiG clearly enough to confirm it was an enemy, the aircraft were already inside the minimum effective range of the Sparrow missile. The technology that was supposed to make dogfighting obsolete was useless in the exact circumstances where it was most needed. The North Vietnamese Air Force was, on paper, vastly outmatched. The Americans had more aircraft, more sophisticated technology, more pilots, and the most powerful naval air arm in the world operating just off the coast. The Vietnamese People's Air Force averaged roughly 70 combat aircraft in the early years of the air campaign and never exceeded 200 at its peak. It should have been a one-sided contest. It was not. The MiG-17 that American pilots encountered over North Vietnam was, in a straight-line speed contest, inferior to the F-4 Phantom. In a turning fight at low and medium speeds, it was a completely different aircraft. The MiG-17 could outturn the Phantom with humiliating ease. It was smaller and harder to see. It carried 3 cannons and it was flown by pilots who understood its strengths with an intimacy born from hundreds of hours of training in that specific aircraft. American pilots had been trained primarily against other American aircraft. An F-4 pilot might have trained extensively against another F-4, but had almost certainly never practiced combat against anything that moved and fought the way a MiG-17 did. The kill-to-loss ratio in air combat that the United States Air Force and Navy achieved over Vietnam was a shock to a military establishment that had expected overwhelming dominance. A classified Navy study initiated by Captain Frank Ault in 1968 tore into the problem without mercy. The findings were stark and they were damning. American pilots were losing engagements they should have won, and the primary reason was training. Specifically, the catastrophic absence of realistic, demanding, dissimilar air combat training. The answer was Top Gun. In 1969, the United States Navy formally established its fighter weapons school at Naval Air Station Miramar in San Diego, California. The program was built on a single ruthless philosophy: teach pilots to fight the way enemies actually fight, not the way doctrine assumed they would fight. Bring in instructors who could fly Soviet tactics, fly aircraft that behaved like Soviet aircraft, put student pilots through engagements so demanding and realistic that when they finally encountered a real enemy, nothing would be entirely new. The alt report had identified specific failures at every level, weapon systems being employed outside their effective envelopes, pilots firing missiles in geometries where a kill was mathematically impossible, entire tactical frameworks built on assumptions that combat was systematically disproving. Top Gun was not a refinement of existing training. It was a wholesale rejection of it. The course was intense. The debrief sessions after each training engagement were longer than the flights themselves. Every decision was examined. Every mistake was named and owned. Instructors who could fly the simulated Soviet role, the aggressor role, were trained to do so with the full tactical knowledge and methodology of the enemy, not a rough approximation of it. The philosophy was simple and completely unforgiving. It is better to lose for the first time over the Nevada desert in a training exercise than to lose for the first time over North Vietnam in front of a real enemy with real weapons. Randy Cunningham was among the earliest graduates of that program. Randy Cunningham had grown up in rural Missouri and had taken the long road into naval aviation, college, a brief stint teaching swimming, then the Navy and the cockpit of the F-4 Phantom. He was competitive in the way that fighter pilots tend to be competitive, which is to say at a level that most people find uncomfortable. He wanted to be the best, and he trained toward it with the kind of single-minded focus that Top Gun was specifically designed to channel and sharpen. In the backseat of Showtime 100 was Lieutenant Willie Driscoll, his radar intercept officer, the man responsible for the aircraft sensors and weapon systems, and for being the second set of eyes and judgment in every engagement. The relationship between a pilot and his Rio in an F-4 was not simply professional. It was intimate in the way that shared danger makes people intimate. They trusted each other with their lives every time they launched from the carrier deck. By the morning of May 10th, 1972, Cunningham and Driscoll already had 2 confirmed aerial victories to their names, 2 MiG kills. They needed 5 to reach A status, a milestone no American naval aviator had achieved since the Second World War. The carrier USS Constellation was operating in the Gulf of Tonkin. The mission that morning was a large-scale strike package against the rail yards at Haiphong near Haiphong, one of North Vietnam's most important logistics nodes. Cunningham and Driscoll launched as part of that package with no particular reason to believe this day would be different from any other. The air battle developed almost immediately upon entering the target area. North Vietnamese MiG fighters rose to intercept the American strike package, and the sky over Haiphong became a violent, turning, three-dimensional brawl that veterans of the air campaign described as unlike anything they had experienced. In the confusion of the engagement, Cunningham and Driscoll were separated from their wingmen. They were alone, in the middle of hostile airspace, with enemy aircraft all around them. With their support structure gone, they were a single aircraft against whatever the sky chose to throw at them. They downed the first MiG-17 with a single Sidewinder heat-seeking missile. Professional, precise, the product of training executed at exactly the right moment. They downed the second MiG-17 the same way, same weapon, same economy of action. 2 kills, 2 aircraft gone from the Vietnamese inventory. The training had worked exactly as designed, but the fuel gauges were falling, and the carrier was still a long way away. With 2 kills secured and every rational calculation telling them to leave, Cunningham and Driscoll turned for the coast and the relative safety of the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The mission was done. They were heading home. That was the moment everything changed. Cunningham saw it closing nose on, a lone MiG-17, head-on geometry, coming directly at them at closing speed that left almost no time to think. Every logical calculation said break off. The fuel state was critical. There was no wingman. 2 kills were already secured, enough for any mission, enough for any pilot to justify disengaging. The carrier recovery window was tightening with every passing second. An experienced pilot weighing the variables on paper would have turned away, and no one could have criticized the decision. Cunningham did not turn away. He had been trained to understand geometry. He knew that a MiG-17 approaching head-on had not yet achieved the angular advantage it needed to bring its guns to bear effectively. He knew the F-4's power advantage in the vertical, that the Phantom could climb faster and harder than the MiG. He knew the move that Top Gun had drilled into him for exactly this kind of moment. He pulled the nose straight up into the vertical, both engines in afterburner, the Phantom surging skyward at full military power, expecting the MiG to continue on its original heading or turn for home. Instead, something happened that in 4.5 years of air combat over Vietnam, almost no American pilot had seen. The MiG followed him up, canopy to canopy, 100 yards apart, perhaps less. 2 aircraft climbing vertically into the upper atmosphere, the Earth falling away beneath them at thousands of feet per minute. Both pilots pressed back into their seats by forces that drained blood from the brain and turned the edges of vision gray. Cunningham looked across and could see the enemy pilot clearly. A leather flight helmet, round flight goggles, a white silk scarf pressed back against the cockpit by the force of the climb. He would write afterward that there was no fear in the other man's eyes, not even a flicker. This was a pilot who had been here before. A pilot who was exactly where he intended to be. What Cunningham and Driscoll did not know in that moment, intelligence would piece it together in the days that followed, was that the pilot in the MiG across from them was believed by American analysts to be the most dangerous fighter pilot in the North Vietnamese Air Force. The Americans called him Colonel Toon. Whatever the complicated truth about that designation, the pilot in that cockpit had accumulated aerial victories against American aircraft in a number that made him, by any measure, a world-class opponent. He had not reached that number by accident. He had reached it by being exactly as calm and as skilled and as committed as the man now looking at him across 100 yards of sky. Two aces, neither aware of the other's identity, both climbing straight up into the blue at the absolute limit of their aircraft and themselves. What followed is now called the vertical rolling scissors in air combat maneuvering doctrine. It is one of the most physically and intellectually demanding engagements in the entire catalog of aerial warfare, and it requires not just skill, but a particular kind of mental clarity under conditions specifically designed to destroy mental clarity. The two aircraft went up, came over the top of the climb, rolled, and re-engaged on the way down, then up again, then down, each time seeking the angle that would place the other aircraft's engine exhaust in front of a weapon, each time being denied by a counter that arrived at exactly the right fraction of a second. The MiG-17 had the advantage in low-speed horizontal maneuvering. The Phantom had the advantage in the vertical. In power and rate of climb, both pilots were using their aircraft's specific strengths with the fluency of someone who had spent a lifetime in that cockpit. For times they went up into the vertical. For times they came back down. Cunningham later described the experience as unlike anything else in his life. A state of total focus, so complete that everything outside the cockpit ceased to exist. There was only the MiG, only the geometry, only the next half-second of decision. His fuel was falling toward a number that meant no second chances. His body was absorbing G-loads that would leave him aching for days. And none of that mattered, because a man in a silver aircraft was trying to kill him and demanded his absolute and complete attention. On the fifth climb, the idea arrived, not from panic, not from desperation, from training, from a concept so deeply embedded in Cunningham's preparation that it surfaced through the noise and the pressure and the physical punishment of the engagement as clearly as if someone had spoken aloud. Energy management. The principle that in an aircraft, speed and altitude are two forms of the same resource, that they can be exchanged, and that the pilot who understands how to make that exchange at the precise right moment can reverse an engagement that looks already decided. Cunningham pulled the throttle to idle. He opened the speed brakes. In a deliberate, controlled act that ran directly against every instinct a fighter pilot is trained on, he made his aircraft dramatically slower, while an enemy was behind him. The Phantom decelerated. The MiG-17 at full power could not stop. It shot forward, out in front. The positions reversed in an instant that lasted less than a second. For the first time in 4.5 minutes of combat, the North Vietnamese ace was out in front of the American. And for the first time in 4.5 minutes of combat, Cunningham had a viable weapon solution. The MiG nosed over into a dive, perhaps trying to convert altitude into the speed it needed to escape, perhaps making one final attempt to bring the fight to terrain it knew. Cunningham lined up his last effective sidewinder and fired. For a terrible second, the missile appeared to miss. Cunningham watched it track toward the MiG and saw what looked like a failure. The flash too small, the aircraft still flying. Then the black smoke came, then the orange flame. The MiG-17's tail section engulfed, and the aircraft did not tumble or spin the way a destroyed aircraft usually does. It flew, a controlled, straight, deliberate dive, directly into ground at 40 degrees. The pilot did not eject. The man in the leather helmet and the goggles and the white scarf, whoever he was and whatever he had accomplished in the sky over North Vietnam, did not come back from that dive. Cunningham was an ace, America's first naval ace since the Korean War. He and Willie Driscoll had done something that day that the entire weight of the Vietnam air campaign had made seem almost unreachable. But the sky had one final statement to make. Seconds after they crossed the North Vietnamese coastline, heading for open water and the safety of the Gulf of Tonkin, a surface-to-air missile found Showtime 100. The explosion did not bring the Phantom down immediately, but it destroyed the hydraulic systems that controlled the aircraft. The Phantom began to burn. Cunningham kept it flying, not through instrumentation, because the instruments were failing, but through feel and experience and a refusal to let the aircraft fall over enemy territory where he and Driscoll will become prisoners. He held it together over the water, and then they ejected. Both men were pulled from the Gulf of Tonkin by a Marine rescue helicopter and returned to the Constellation, soaking wet and, against every probability, alive. In the days and weeks that followed, United States military analysts began the work of understanding what May 10, 1972 had produced. It had been the most intense aerial engagement day of the entire war. The Navy alone had shot down 8 MiG aircraft. Cunningham and Driscoll had accounted for 3 of them, all in a single flight, making their 5-kill total the highest of any American naval aviator in the conflict. But the analysis that mattered most was not about the individual engagements. It was about the pattern. The Red Baron reports, a classified, exhaustive study of every air-to-air engagement the United States had fought over Vietnam, had been accumulating data since the mid-1960s. By the early 1970s, the findings were in, and they were impossible to ignore. Pilots who had received proper, realistic, dissimilar air combat training performed dramatically better than those who had not. The kill-to-loss ratio for naval aviators who had been through Top Gun was nearly 12-1. The broader campaign average was a fraction of that. The difference was not aircraft. It was not technology. It was not courage or native ability or luck. It was training. Specifically, it was the quality and realism of training. The engagements like Cunningham's, the ones where an outnumbered, fuel-critical pilot had found one more idea in a 4.5-minute fight, were not outliers. They were evidence. Evidence that when human beings are genuinely, rigorously, specifically prepared for the worst situation they might face, they perform at a level that those without that preparation cannot reach. The data said so. In numbers too large to argue with, the United States Air Force drew its own conclusions from Vietnam and acted on them in 1975 with the establishment of Red Flag, a program built on the same foundational philosophy as Top Gun, but scaled to the full complexity of modern air warfare. Red Flag took place at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, over 15,000 square miles of designated airspace that could simulate virtually any combat environment. It pitted real pilots flying real aircraft against dedicated adversary squadrons, aggressor units whose entire purpose was to emulate Soviet tactics with as much fidelity as possible, flying similar aircraft, using similar radio procedures, executing similar attack geometries. The aggressor pilots were specifically selected, then put through an intensive indoctrination into Soviet aerial warfare doctrine. When they went up against student pilots, they fought the way Soviet pilots would have fought. The philosophy behind Red Flag was captured in a single, brutal observation that its founders kept returning to. Statistical analysis showed that a pilot's chance of surviving an entire combat tour improved dramatically if they survived their first 10 missions. The first 10 were when pilots were most vulnerable, when the gap between training and reality was widest, when the things they did not know could kill them. Red Flag's purpose was to make those first 10 missions happen over the Nevada desert, where the cost of losing was a bruised ego and a long debrief, not a burning aircraft. Within a decade of its founding, Allied air forces from across NATO and beyond were sending their pilots to Red Flag. The philosophy was spreading. The lesson of Vietnam, that training quality is not a variable to be optimized against cost, but a foundational determinant of who comes home, was becoming the standard of serious military aviation everywhere. The specific maneuver that Cunningham used to reverse the engagement, the controlled deceleration in the vertical, the throttle to idle that made the MiG pass in front, is now a documented case study in air combat maneuvering doctrine. It is taught by name, the conditions that made it work, the risks involved in executing it, the precise timing required, the energy state the aircraft must be in for maneuver to be viable. All of it is analyzed, debated, and drilled in air combat training programs that span dozens of nations. This is not a small thing. When a tactic or a maneuver passes from a single engagement into formal doctrine, it means that analysts have examined it, validated it, and determined that its principles are generalizable, that they apply beyond the specific aircraft and the specific opponent and the specific geography of the original engagement. The principles of energy management that Cunningham applied in those final seconds of the fight are not unique to an F-4 versus a MiG-17. They apply to any aircraft versus any opponent where the relevant energy states exist. Every pilot who learns that principle today, in whatever aircraft, in whatever country, flying against whatever simulated threat, is in some way flying to the echo of 4.5 minutes over North Vietnam. They may not know the name of the engagement. They may not know the story of the man who first demonstrated under live fire against a world-class opponent. But the idea is there, embedded in the doctrine, carried forward from cockpit to cockpit across 50 years of military aviation. What is often lost in the retelling of this story, lost in the heroism and statistics and the doctrine, is how close it came to ending differently. Cunningham himself never described May 10, 1972 as a fight he won. He described it as a fight he survived, and he was careful about the distinction. The pilot across from him in that engagement was not an accident waiting to happen. He was not a beginner who happened to encounter an American ace. He was exceptional, calm, technically precise, tactically fluent, and in full command of an aircraft he knew better than most men know anything. 4.5 minutes of engagement, and he never gave Cunningham the clear shot he needed. Every time the Phantom pressed an advantage, the MiG countered. Every time it looked like the geometry was resolving in Cunningham's favor, the Vietnamese pilot found the answer. The idea that changed the outcome, the throttle to idle, the speed brakes, the deliberate deceleration, worked by a margin that Cunningham could feel more than measure. A slightly different energy state, a slightly different altitude, a fraction of a second's difference in timing, and it does not work. The MiG does not pass in front. The shot is not there. And the story that 50 years of military aviation has been learning from is a very different story. That is the real lesson, not the specific maneuver, not the specific outcome. The lesson is that genuine preparation gives a human being access to ideas under pressure that no unprepared person can reach. And in the sky, the unprepared do not get second chances. There's a dimension of this story that military historians increasingly acknowledge, and that deserves to be part of any honest account of what happened over Vietnam. The North Vietnamese pilots who flew against American aircraft during those years were, by any fair measure, extraordinary aviators, flying Soviet-supplied aircraft that were in most respects technically outclassed by what they faced, operating under an American electronic warfare environment designed to blind their ground control networks, doing so without the logistical depth or pilot replacement capacity that the Americans took for granted. They nonetheless achieved results that sent the most powerful air force on Earth back to its classrooms. The engagement of May 10th, 1972 was as significant as it was precisely because both sides brought exceptional capability to it. The 4.5 minutes of the vertical rolling scissors were 4.5 minutes during which a North Vietnamese pilot matched an American Top Gun graduate maneuver for maneuver, turn for turn, idea for idea, until one of them found something the other did not have an answer to. Without that level of opponent, there is no lesson. Without a pilot skilled enough to make the fight last 4.5 minutes. Cunningham's throttle to idle is just a textbook illustration that was never tested. Military aviation learned from the courage and the skill on both sides of that war. The doctrine that came out of it belongs to everyone who flew in it. After returning from Vietnam, Cunningham became an instructor at Top Gun. He took the thing he had survived and turned it into curriculum. The debriefing sessions he led at NAS Miramar were, by the account of students who attended them, unlike anything they had experienced in any prior military education. He had not studied the engagement from a distance or reconstructed it from gun camera footage. He had lived it, second by second, at speeds and G-loads that compressed 4.5 minutes into something that felt both infinite and instantaneous. He could describe the moment the idea arrived not as a technical observation, but as a physical memory. This is a thing that formal doctrine cannot fully capture, but that every serious military training program tries to create. The transmission of real experience from someone who has been tested at the absolute limit to someone who has not yet been tested at all. Books and diagrams and classified reports can carry the outline of what happened. The instructor who was there can carry something else. The specific texture of the pressure, the way the geometry felt when it was resolving incorrectly, the sensation of the throttle going to idle with a world-class opponent behind you. Cunningham later became commanding officer VF 126, the adversary squadron at NAS Miramar, the unit that played the role of the enemy in training exercises, that embodied the aggressive philosophy in everyday operations. He spent years doing exactly what Top Gun had been built to do, creating opponents good enough to make American pilots genuinely better. By the 1980s, the philosophy born in the debriefing rooms of Top Gun and the Nevada skies of Red Flag had spread into virtually every Allied Air Force that took aerial combat seriously. The United Kingdom, Israel, Australia, France, Germany, the Gulf states, each in its own way adapted the core principle that the quality of training is the primary determinant of combat performance, that realistic dissimilar air combat training saves lives in ways that no amount of superior equipment can substitute for, and that the willingness to create brutally honest training environments where good pilots lose regularly, where the lessons are uncomfortable, where instructors pull apart every decision without mercy, is not a luxury but an operational necessity. The Israeli Air Force, which had been integrating many of these principles in its own way and achieving kill ratios that analysts found almost impossible to credit, became a model studied alongside the American experience. The Indian subcontinent, the Gulf region, Eastern Europe, wherever serious military aviation existed, the Vietnam lessons were being absorbed and translated into local training doctrine. All of it traces back, at some point in the chain of doctrine and analysis and institutional learning, to the hard truth that Vietnam revealed, that America's most expensive, most powerful, most technically sophisticated Air Force had been beaten to near parity by a smaller, poorer, less equipped opponent because it stopped taking seriously the human side of air combat. The machines were extraordinary. The training had failed the men inside them. Top Gun was a correction, and the correction changed everything. The story of Showtime 100 raises a question that goes beyond aviation, beyond Vietnam, beyond the specific aircraft and the specific geography and the specific political circumstances of that war. What is a human being actually capable of when they are genuinely, rigorously prepared? When every relevant skill has been built to the point where it no longer requires conscious thought, when the muscle memory and the tactical instinct are deep enough to survive the moment when conscious thought collapses under pressure. The answer that May 10th, 1972 offers is not a comfortable one, because it implies that most of us are operating at a fraction of what preparation could unlock. Cunningham found an idea in the fifth climb of a 4.5-minute fight. Exhausted, fuel critical, without a wingman, against the best opponent he had ever faced. He found it not by being superhuman, but by being prepared enough that the idea was accessible when the pressure was at its absolute maximum. That is the inheritance, not the specific maneuver, not the medal, not the kill count. The inheritance is the evidence, documented in the classified reports, embedded in the doctrine, carried forward in the training programs of dozens of air forces. That preparation at genuine depth produces outcomes that raw ability and advanced technology alone cannot guarantee. 50 years on, in simulator pods and real cockpits across 6 continents, young pilots are learning the principles that a 4.5-minute fight over North Vietnam made undeniable. They are, in that specific sense, still flying to the shape of what happened between 2 extraordinary men in the sky above Haiphong on a May afternoon in 1972. If this story gave you something to think about, if the question of what preparation actually unlocks in a human being is one you want to keep pulling on, then this channel exists for exactly that purpose. Deep Insight covers the stories that textbooks reduce to a single sentence, but that deserve to be told in full. The battles that changed doctrine, the decisions that nobody made in ideal conditions, the moments where one idea at the right instant reversed what looked like a settled outcome. There are hundreds of them, from every corner of military history and beyond, and every one of them carries a lesson that is more interesting and more useful than the headline suggests. Subscribe to Deep Insight so you do not miss the next one. Hit the like button if this video gave you something genuine. And drop a comment below with your answer to this question. What do you think separates the pilot who finds the one idea from the pilot who does not? Is it training? Is it character? Or is it something that cannot be named? We read every comment. The real conversation happens in the section below this video, and your perspective is part of it. We will see you in the next one.